Hello, and welcome to the BigTime Strength Podcast, featuring small school strength coaches from around the nation that are making the big time where they are at. Before we get to the episode, we'd like to thank our sponsors that make this podcast possible. TeamBuildr is a strength and conditioning software that allows coaches to build training programs, create wellness questionnaires, access and track athlete data, and more. Athletes can log data using phones, tablets, or laptops and can watch exercise videos so they know exactly what to do. Coaches can use the tools within the platform to monitor athlete recovery and readiness. Be sure to sign up now with code BigTime and you will gain access to a 30-day free trial. This episode is also brought to you by Powerlift. Taking your athletic facility from concept to completion can be a challenge. It is Powerlift's goal to make the process as seamless as possible from start to finish. Their weight equipment is made from the toughest materials that can withstand excessive use from coaches and athletes for years to come. It's sought after for its unique design, customizable appearance, affordability, and superior warranty that training facilities deserve. Powerlift helps design weight rooms with the athlete in mind, and they pride themselves on their ability to outfit athletic facilities based on a team's unique goals. That's why high schools, universities, professional sports teams, and athletic performance facilities around the world have chosen Powerlift to help maximize their strength training goals. Call Powerlift today to be contacted with a rep in your area and give us a follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to see for yourself why our clients are Powerlift proud. Finally, this episode is also brought to you by Vitruve. Vitruve is a velocity-based training system designed for colleges and high schools around the world. It is accurate, reliable, and affordable. The software is quick and easy to set up and use with a whole room of athletes simultaneously. Coaches have chosen Vitruve because it simplifies VBT and allows them to seamlessly integrate it on a daily basis. Check out Vitruve now for your school's free demo unit. Now, let's get to this week's episode.
All right, I don't need to go through a bio or anything because Preston pretty much nailed it. But he said, my name is John Engelbrecht. I am an assistant strength and conditioning coach at the University of Iowa with the football program. I just want to start by thanking everybody for being here today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my ideas, concepts, and experiences with you. And then also a big thanks to Preston and all those people involved putting on an event like this. Like he said, I think it's great that people in this field, professionals, are getting together to kind of better themselves for their student athletes. My hope today is that you'll be able to take away both practical, actionable ideas that you can take and apply in your setting, but also to walk away with conceptually maybe some different ways of thinking about how we approach strength and conditioning for our athletes. So getting into the presentation, I don't need to give you a brief background anymore, but just a couple, I will go to the first slide. Just a couple disclaimers. Opinions are my own. A lot of it is influenced by Iowa football, but there's certain things that I would do differently if I was in a situation where I wasn't working with football, right? Or if I was in a high school setting. I'm doing my best to distill what I've learned from my experiences and classroom learning, professional development, but I'm certainly going to make some assumptions along the way. I am a collegiate strength and conditioning coach. I have minimal experience with working with Preston high school setting. Some of my assumptions may not play out the way I think they would for you as high school strength and conditioning coaches. Secondly, I am kind of a skeptic by nature. I don't think that there is a right answer or even a best answer to a lot of strength and conditioning athletic development questions. I think that context always matters, right? So all of you have different backgrounds. You find yourself in different situations and scenarios. So keeping in mind that your context is going to matter when you're listening and trying to take away from this presentation. I'm very weary of saying that I never or always implement something, right? Because that context always matters. And then lastly, I try not to take myself too seriously. Sometimes I do probably more than I should, but I try not to. I think that without detracting from the important impact that we can have on the lives of young people, it's important to understand that this isn't rocket science, it's not life or death. We should be able to have a lot of fun while we're doing it. So I think the perhaps biggest part of any successful strength and conditioning program or a team, any organization in general really, is going to be the culture that organization fosters. And I know culture is maybe a bit of a buzzword, but whether you want to say like the environment or the buy-in that you can create. It's all the same thing. Whatever we want to call it, what we're trying to do is enhance athlete engagement and motivation. I think a great way to do that is by following a theory known as the self-determination theory. It's, if you open just a sports psych textbook or the NSCA study book, it's going to be right in there. It's kind of a foundational sports psych theory. But what it says is that to foster engagement and motivation in athletes, there's 3 basic psychological needs that need to be met. That's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So starting with autonomy. As strength and conditioning coaches, how can we give our athletes a choice in their training? How can we make our athletes feel like they are in control of their training experience? It doesn't have to be anything crazy. It could be as simple as giving the athletes a choice of like an arm finisher or a torso finisher at the end of a workout. But as athletes progress through a training program, I think it's important that we give them more control of their experience, because then they're going to feel like their say matters. They're responsible for their training outcomes. Secondly is competence. I think we're probably all familiar with what that means, but as coaches, how can we make sure, or how can we ensure success in our athletes' training experience? How can we make sure that they realize success? But also, it's important that we normalize failure in their training process, right? Athletes are going to fail. That shouldn't be viewed as a negative experience, right? It's a normal part of strength and conditioning, athletic training. It's a normal part of life. So normalizing failure, but making sure that athletes feel like they can succeed. If we're not competent as coaches or whatever profession we find ourselves in, it's going to deter us from really being engaged in that, right? So we want our athletes to feel like they can have success. Then the third tenet is relatedness. So making our athletes feel seen, making them feel like they belong. Doesn't take much. It can be as simple as giving every kid a fist bump every day, making sure you acknowledge every kid every day. Use their name in a sentence. But as coaches, understanding that certain kids are going to need more. Certain kids come from different backgrounds, and they're going to need more validation from us as coaches. And that's not a bad thing. That's not something that we should roll our eyes at. We need to understand that it's part of our job, is giving these kids validation and making them recognize their importance. So that's kind of the cultural portion of this slide, and then fostering a culture of competition. I think a great way to do that is through a system that we use at the University of Iowa. It's not an Iowa original. We kind of stole this concept from Tony Holler. He's a high school track and field coach in the state of Illinois. But the system, measure, rank, and post, it's exactly as it sounds. What we're trying to do is take any training metric that we can quantify, whether it's how fast an athlete can run, how high they can jump, how far they can throw a med ball or an implement, and even their strength numbers in the weight room. We take those numbers, we rank them, and we post them to where these athletes can see it. What this does is it fosters competition, engagement, and improvement among our athletes, right? If an athlete sees, hey, this is what my teammates are getting, I'm going to push to try and achieve that. They can also see what they've done in the past, right? So when we're tracking, an athlete can see, hey, these are the numbers I hit previously, I'm going to do my best to beat those. Noticing that with this measure, rank, and post system, you may have to take a teams versus class or teams versus other teams approach, right? Just because it may be a great idea for certain teams that have, a high level of a high competitive atmosphere, recognizing that some teams may not be as comfortable. Like an athlete may not be super comfortable with their numbers being put out to where their teammates can see it. If they aren't super confident in their outputs or their performance, they may not feel comfortable with their teammates viewing it. We do stand behind this as a system that enhances athletic intent, but understanding that in a classroom setting, you may need to use your discretion in implementing something like this. And then I kind of missed it, but as coaches, I think we need to try really hard to make it fun for our athletes. Like you as high school strength and conditioning coaches, you've got the athletes for 4 years tops. Some of them are going to play after that, but most of them, we need to be focusing on building good habits of, habits of lifelong appreciation for exercise, for physical activity. we need to make it fun as coaches. I'm not saying you need to be a cheerleader, but if you had to pick between being like a cheerleader or a drill sergeant, I'd certainly err towards that cheerleader side. We want to make it fun. We want to make it engaging for our athletes. So going forward, after we have that cultural foundation built in our programs, I know I talked about that measure, rank, and post system and how we track outputs. I want to talk about the importance and the values of athlete tracking and how we can kind of manage our athletes across time. So the three main values, this is not an exhaustive list, but one of the top values is being able to determine the relevant training goals for your athletes. As we track their outputs across time, we can see, hey, where is this athlete trending? What do I think their goal should be? Not only for the individual, but for the team that individual is on. What are relevant training goals? How strong do I think one of my football players needs to be? How high do I think a successful front row in volleyball needs to be able to jump? So tracking those for the team, and then also just the age group. Secondly, providing visuals and motivation for our athletes. So that measure, rank, and post system, that can provide the visual for the athletes, seeing where they're trending across time, how they compare to their teammates, but even being able to, make graphs for our athletes and see, hey, this is where your training is trending across time. It doesn't have to be for each athlete individually. If you have certain processes automated, that makes that easier, but even just in a team setting, hey, this is where your training is trending across time. For most developmental athletes, high school athletes, you can have them do just about anything and they're going to get stronger, right? Just because they don't have a ton of exposure to training. But showing them that they're trending up across time is going to enhance their motivation and engagement in your program. Lastly, being able to determine your estimated 1-rep maxes for more accurate load prescription ranges. So when we're tracking, what athletes are able to do across time in the weight room, on the field, it allows us to better prescribe their training going forward. How do we want to do athlete management? That's a question that all of us kind of have to answer dependent on our budget, dependent on what resources we have. If you have the budget for it, there's great apps like TeamBuildr and Platform. I know a few high schools that are able to use these. Their budget affords that to them. If you find a budget constraint where you can't swing something like that, even just getting proficient with Google Sheets. I know Preston is great with Google Sheets, Excel. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you can automate how you're tracking your athletes and you have kind of like a central hub of where you're keeping all of your training data versus just trying to do it with a pen and paper and writing it down. If you can, I would encourage you to ditch pen and paper because it's going to make your life a lot easier if you can leverage technology to keep track of that data. Going forward, after we kind of have a system for managing our athletes and tracking their training outputs across time, I think as strength and conditioning coaches, it's important that we are very objective about the constraints that we face. Everybody in this room is going to face different constraints, but I think the three main categories we can break those down into are going to be time, equipment, and experience. The first one, time. It's important that we determine what the most important thing for our athletes is. What are we going to dedicate most of our time towards? This might change. It's certainly going to be different across groups, teams, classes, age groups, and it may change for a given group across the year. It may be more consistent for other groups. Just because we determine something is the most important thing, however, does not mean that it needs to be the only thing we train. We can train multiple qualities, but it should have some sort of priority in our training. For most developmental high school athletes, I would say that strength, just general strength, is going to be the quality that we should approach with most of our energy, right? Getting an athlete stronger is going to make them more powerful. Getting an athlete stronger a lot of times is going to make them faster. Secondly, after the strength, I think just general speed, allowing our athletes a lot of exposures to being able to run fast, right? Doesn't have to be fancy. We don't have to get too far into the weeds, just letting the athletes run fast to get fast. And then work capacity is a third quality that I think a lot of high school kids need to improve. A lot of developmental athletes, even guys we have come to us at the University of Iowa, they need to enhance their work capacity. What I mean by this is not necessarily their conditioning or their muscular endurance, but just being able to tolerate more physical training across time, just because they haven't had that experience to consistent training in the weight room. They just need more exposure so they can build a base of training to handle future training. Second constraint, equipment. This, truthfully, is probably going to be one of the easier constraints that we face, just because you don't need a ton of equipment to run a really high-level strength and conditioning program. Outside of like space for your athletes, you don't need a ton of fancy equipment, bells and whistles. It doesn't take much. But as strength and conditioning coaches, making a list of what we have to use in equipment, making a list of what we think we need, what do I think I need to enhance my athlete's training experience? And then truthfully, what can you get rid of? Because just because you have something at your disposal does not mean that it needs to be used in your training programs. And then the third constraint, experience. Experience and the varying levels are going to be constraints for all of us. A great example is Olympic lifts. Some of us may not be super comfortable or proficient at teaching the Olympic lifts, but we maybe see other programs that are using them and we think that that's something that we need to use. If you can't demonstrate it, do it at a high level, teach it at a high level, I would caution you from asking your athletes to do it. And on the flip side of that, just because you are very experienced with a certain technique, maybe you're great at coaching and you're very proficient with the Olympic lifts, does not mean that your athletes need to be doing them. Now, I'm not saying don't do Olympic lifts. That's not what I want you to take away from here. But just understanding that our experience is going to limit us, whether it's with the Olympic lifts, how we coach the different power lifts, being objective about what we're capable of coaching. And then a great example of overcoaching, I think once we get into speed training, there's a lot of overcoaching that takes place. If you're not a speed guru, or if you're not don't have a ton of experience as a track and field coach, I would caution you from getting too far into the weeds with speed drills, running technique. I think with a lot of developmental athletes, we can just say, hey, we're going to try and get you to run fast, and you're going to get faster. So being cautious of overcueing. After we consider our constraints, going forward into developing a program for our athletes. So with programming, I think a lot of coaches try and get too far into the future in planning out training for their athletes. I know at least a lot of collegiate strength and conditioning coaches will pride themselves on this really fancy, detailed annual plan that has the sets and reps and rest time just down to a T for every phase of the year. For collegiate coaches, and especially for, I would think, high school coaches who have, a lot less resources at their disposal, a lot more probably chaos in the lives of their athletes from a multi-sport aspect, I would say good luck in developing a well-thought-out annual plan, right? Life happens, whether it's just the chaos of sport in general, and then when you factor in multi-sport athletes, you factor in class and activity conflict, and then the differing rates of adaptation that each one of your athletes is going to experience. Because a given stimulus is going to affect almost all of your athletes differently. Considering that there's so much chaos involved with this, I think that we should take a more conservative approach to planning our training out in the future. I think taking a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach is going to offer us a better option in planning realistic training for our athletes. By bottom-up, I mean always considering what constraints we face, whether that's time, equipment, or experience, and then planning out training from there, as opposed to taking a top-down approach and saying, hey, this is what I've seen done, or this is what I've read is a great thing to do with this group of athletes. I want to do this. I want to stick to the plan. This is going to be the optimal approach. But then when the rubber hits the road, hey, I don't have the time to do this. I don't have the resources. I don't have the experience to coach this. So starting small and building from there, given the constraints that we face. Some coaches that are great at this and will give great examples of how to take a more bottom-up or more of a, I don't want to say short-sighted, but kind of a small-level approach. Mladen Jovanovic, he's a Croatian strength and conditioning coach. In his book, Agile Periodization, the Strength Training Manual, he does get a little far into the weeds with certain technical aspects of strength and conditioning, but I think that anybody really interested in strength and conditioning theory, I think that's one of my must-reads. I really enjoyed it, and he does a great job of being realistic in how we plan training for our athletes. And then Daniel Bove, I believe he's still, at least he was, the head strength and conditioning and sport performance coach for the New Orleans Pelicans, but he does a great job as well, taking an approach to training where he always considers his constraints. So as he coaches an NBA team, they're always on the road, saying, hey, we're on the road, how can we factor in training even though we're training out of a hotel or we're training on this amount of sleep because we've been traveling for so long. Always factoring in your constraints before you plan training. Talking consistency versus intensity. So this is a trade-off. I'm not saying to avoid intensity in our training, but I think that being able to approach from the mindset that we want to emphasize consistency in our athletes, and that if we're always pursuing intensity, we're always like burying our athletes with really high loads, trying to lift them as heavy as possible, as often as possible, there is going to be a trade-off, right? They aren't going to be able to do that forever. I think as coaches of developmental athletes, we should take a more slow cook approach to their training. We should aim to raise their average performance across time by offering them the minimum effective dose of training, just enough training to stimulate an adaptation. So this is more of a pull the floor approach versus a push the ceiling approach where we're really kind of hammering our athletes, really trying to get them to chase PRs and raise their peak performance. Now, I'm not saying that developmental athletes shouldn't see PRs, because a lot of times developmental athletes, high school athletes, they don't have to do much and they're going to see PRs across time. They're going to get better. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't see PRs, but just being cautious about really trying to chase those, right? Really trying to hammer them home. I think it's a better idea to be conservative in our approach and to let the adaptation and the gains come to us instead of really trying to chase them. Vertically integrated training. So Zach DeChant, he's the head strength and conditioning coach for Texas Christian baseball. He's going to give a much better, succinct explanation in a short video on the next slide. But what vertically integrated training essentially is we're going to do everything year-round, whether that's strength training, speed training, conditioning, power training, jump training. We're going to do it all year-round, but in varying volumes. So we're going to train multiple qualities throughout the year, or concurrently. That's another synonym, is concurrent training. But a quote from him is, the thread of each quality is always going to remain in the program. And then after this, the video on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about workout design, blocks, pairing, just a brief example. So here's Zach DeChant for you on vertical integration.
I get a ton of questions on vertical integration. This is vertical integration in 60 seconds. The top row is traditionally how we think of training. Our biomotor quality, strength, power, speed, hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is not really a biomotor quality, but for this example, it works just fine. We traditionally block those out and train that quality while the other qualities fall to the wayside. With vertical integration, all those pieces are present at all times. Speed, power, strength, hypertrophy. We only vary the volumes of each of those qualities. We can throw more volume and more intensity at one or two motor qualities and bring those up while the others are maintained. In the first block, maybe strength needs to be brought up. We attack it with more volume and intensity while speed, power, and hypertrophy are maintained. The next block, maybe we see power needs to be increased. We can attack that with more adaptation energy while maintaining speed, strength, and hypertrophy. The benefit or advantage of vertical integration is we can throw more adaptation energy, more stress at one quality to bring that up while maintaining the others. The second big advantage is, since we're maintaining all the others, we can swap and interchange qualities at any time. So we may say, we may find the data says that we need to change our program and emphasize speed in this upcoming block. We can switch and go straight to speed. Team sport athletes need a variety of biomotor abilities. This allows us to have all those biomotor abilities in the program at the same time and figure out which ones need attacking at that time.
So there's Zach DeChant with a great explanation of vertically integrated training. The only thing I would add to that is that when we're training team sport athletes, we should always consider what the athletes are getting from their practice and what they may not need from us as strength coaches. So for example, if an athlete's in a competitive phase and they're practicing, they're getting a lot of sprint volume in practice, maybe a volleyball or basketball athlete, they're getting a lot of ground contacts, plyometric exposures in practice, then we can scale that back in our training. We don't need to give them that as much during that phase of the year because they're already getting it from their sport. I think vertical integration is a great way to approach team sport athlete physical training because, like DeChant said, there's so many qualities that factor into success. And then just touching on like an example of workout design. So we're always going to start with, from the top, 2-day example. If you wanted to go a 3-day example, you could take day 1, slide it over, and just change up the movement patterns that you use, right? You just use different exercises. But we're always going to start with a warm-up, something athletic, so run, jump, throw. After that, we're going to transition into the weight room. I've got this first pairing in red font because it may not be necessary. This first pairing is going to be like our power exercises, our ground-based explosive exercises. These may not be necessary if we feel that whatever we did on the field or court, sprint, jump, throw, already satisfies that power training bucket, right? So if we're already doing sled pushes, high-intensity sprints, jump training on the field, that is power work in and of itself, and we may not need to spend time doing a ground-based explosive movement in the weight room, so like an Olympic variation, a loaded jump, a kettlebell swing. That doesn't mean that we have to cut it out, but if, say, time is a constraining factor, then we don't need to worry about doing that in the weight room. That being said, after we get through our power training, we're going to get into the more meat and potatoes strength work of the session. Typically, I would use a lower-upper pairing as well as a push-pull pairing to try and eliminate any like crossover effect fatigue from different muscle groups. We would try and pair exercises that don't have similar muscular or energetic demands. At the end of a workout, typically finish it with some sort of torso movement, rotate, carry something heavy, hold something heavy, and then pairing that with a posterior shoulder, whether that's face pulls, band pull-aparts, your prehab exercises, or just some arm fluff. Going forward, so now I'm going to take you through a sequence of a workout as I would prescribe it. So from warm-up to recovery, and some concepts that I really like, and maybe some concepts that I think are maybe not necessary in how we approach physical training for our athletes. But starting with a warm-up, so we can divide warm-ups into 2 main categories, right? It's either a general warm-up or a specific warm-up. Before I get farther into that, I do think that warm-ups are maybe the number one area where coaches tend to overdo it. Let's not major in the minors, right? We should take a minimum effective dose approach to our warm-ups because that's all they are. They're warming us up for the training session that is actually going to deliver a stimulus that drives adaptation. We're probably not chasing a whole lot of adaptation in our warm-up. We're just trying to prepare our athletes for the training session. So it doesn't have to be anything crazy or extensive. But general warm-up, in a nutshell, you're just trying to increase the muscle or core body temperature, the heart rate, get their blood pumping, right? This can be as simple as having them jog laps, a dynamic warm-up, or just having them play a game. Specific warm-up is going to be neuromuscular activation and rehearsal. I think rehearsal is a big part of that. Activation is kind of a buzzword that we hear a lot, but I think the big part is rehearsal. So if it's specific, we're essentially going to be practicing whatever we're doing in a given training session. Now, general and specific warm-ups can be used independently, or they can be used together in a more extensive warm-up. In that case, we're going to start with a general warm-up and progress towards a specific warm-up. Now, talking about dynamic warm-up, this can fit kind of into either section. So if all we're doing that day is lifting, a dynamic warm-up is going to be quite general, okay? Whether it's on a field or court and we're running around, that's going to be general to a lift. However, if we're going into a speed session, we're training our athletes to run, jump, change direction, a dynamic warm-up then becomes more specific. For any just weight training, lifting we're going to be doing in the weight room, short power-related performances, a specific warm-up is sufficient. If we're just lifting our athletes, we don't need to have an in-depth general warm-up. It can just be a brief, specific warm-up. And what is a specific warm-up? If we're squatting, a specific warm-up for squatting is as simple as warm-up sets. So starting with an athlete's body weight, progressing them to a goblet squat or a barbell, and then working up from there. Clamshells or glute bridges are not going to be a specific warm-up for a squat. And here's just a quote from this Iverson et al. Article. There is little support for including general warm-ups when time is of the essence. But for some, specific warm-ups can be useful, particularly for heavy loads greater than 80% of 1 rep maximum. In a nutshell, if we're going to lift heavy, we need to warm our athletes up for it, but it doesn't have to be extensive. It can be as simple as giving them more warm-up sets. So that's kind of the general overview of warm-up. On the next slide, I'm going to get into a little more of the specifics of how we approach warm-ups. Again, always factoring in the constraints that we face, whether that's time, space, or equipment, and then also what the session goal is. Like I touched on, if it's just a strength training session, our goal for that is strength, right? So we don't have to maybe prepare our athletes for speed work or change of direction work. We can save some time in that regard. Now, if it is speed focused, we're going to want to approach probably with a dynamic warm-up. If it's a sprint day, then a linear dynamic warm-up. If it's a change of direction day or maybe a practice day, then a more of a combined linear, lateral, dynamic warm-up. Your warm-up is ideally going to be specific to the demands of the training session. So foam rolling, see it used a lot, is neither necessary nor sufficient as a warm-up. If the athletes like it, that's fine, but it's not something that is necessary in a warm-up. Same thing with a lot of the activation drills. I kind of talked about clamshells, glute bridges. A lot of these drills that we see done probably don't do what we think they do in terms of preparing our athletes for a training session. This right here, the Sportsmith, is an article. That's the title of the article. It's written by, actually no, it's not written by Joel Smith. The name of the author escapes me, but it just talks about how maybe we can take a different approach or reassess all of the activation work we do before a training session. Now, I know it seems like I'm saying, just do warm-up sets or just do something very specific to the training session. I will say that even if it's general, there's a ton of value to a dynamic warm-up, right? So it is specific to any speed and change of direction work we're going to do, but even if all we're doing is lifting, a dynamic warm-up can serve to enhance that work capacity of our athletes. It can increase their tissue resiliency by giving them more exposures to ground contacts, kind of repetitive, almost plyometric work. And it's also a super efficient way to warm your athletes up. If you have space, it's really efficient. Even if you don't have space, you can do just an in-place dynamic warm-up, and it's a great way to get our athletes prepared. That being said, if it's not specific, it needs to at least be useful, right? So a dynamic warm-up can still be useful if it's not specific to the training session. And maybe if it's not specific and you don't think it's super useful, it needs to at least be fun, right? So if a kid's going into a lifting session and you think, we're just going to do warm-up sets. Yeah, that's sufficient and necessary, but if you got a little extra time, give them a game to play, right? Like let them play spike ball. Spike ball is general for a lift, but I'd say it's extremely specific to any change of direction, agility work you're going to do, and it's fun, right? Providing that fun experience for our athletes is going to just increase their buy-in to our programs. It's going to, make them want to show up and train. And then I already hit on that. If it's just strictly strength training, give them more warm-up sets if time is a constraining factor. After we hit our warm-up, we're always going to try and do something athletic if we have the time, right? If you only have time to lift, that's one thing. But if you have time, I encourage you to have them sprint, jump, or throw something, okay? This is an area where I think a lot of coaches kind of are out of their comfort zone. I'll be very open. I'm much more comfortable in the weight room. That's where I enjoy being, lifting, training in the weight room. But I think we need to recognize that from a performance standpoint, this run, jump, throw, sprint, jump, throw is going to be much more important than lifting in the weight room. So it's not something that we can shy away from as strength and conditioning coaches. To start, I think a lot of coaches could ditch the drills when we're thinking about speed training, sprint exposure. By drills, I mean these isolated arm action drills, like keeping our elbow at 90 or leaning up against a wall and doing these isolated like leg swing or leg strike drills. Arm action and leg action don't occur independently in sport, in the real world, right? So I don't think it's of great use to train them in such a way. Instead, I would encourage you to try and set constraints for your athletes and allow them to self-organize and find out what works for them. Okay, all athletes are going to move differently. They're going to draw on different movement strategies. So it's important that we give them exposure and time to figure things out for themselves. This is an article written by Joel Smith, but it's kind of a take on these 3 speed training methods that don't really work how we think they do, and then some alternatives that we can use instead. Getting more specific into our speed training, simply to get fast, you just got to run fast. So I've talked a lot about intent, engagement, motivation. A great way to do that, to get your athletes to run fast, is to gamify things, right? Turn it into a game. Have them chase a teammate. Have them compete against their teammates. Get them on a stopwatch. Use timing gates if you have them. Some way to drive intent, right? We hear a lot of numbers like 90, 95%. They need to be above 95% to really affect a change in their sprinting. That's pretty intense. Athletes have to run fast if we want them to get fast. If we want to talk about the specific sprint volumes of a session, Zach DeChant he puts out a lot of great content on that. In his book, Movement Over Maxes, he has a chart that really talks about, hey, what is a low volume, medium volume, high volume day for a team sport athlete? In my opinion, which is certainly influenced by DeChant, it's best to keep session volumes lower, but have a higher frequency of exposure for your athletes. So trying to get them to sprint fast 2-3 times a week, but keeping session volumes relatively low. For most team sport athletes, the vast majority of our sprint training is going to be in that 10 to 30 yard range. So it's not hard to give an athlete 3 to 5 or more exposures in a training session to a 10 to 30 yard range while still keeping the session volume relatively low, and in turn giving us the ability to repeat that session with frequency throughout the week, 2 or 3 times. A lot of these concepts also apply to our jump training. So our plyometric training, our landing training, or our spatial awareness. It shouldn't always look pretty because sport often doesn't look pretty. I know that a lot of times we want to kind of shove athletes into this box of, hey, you need to land perfectly square with your knees over your toes and your chest up. That doesn't really occur in sport or in practice. I don't think that there's such thing as perfect technique when we're jumping or landing. And instead of trying to hammer home one perfect technique, I think it's important that we expose our athletes to a variety of movements, a variety of demands to help them develop a broad movement bandwidth. So this is a phrase that Nick DeMarco uses in his book, 8-Vector System. He's currently the head of sport performance at Elon University out in the Carolinas. But essentially, he's trying to expose his athletes to a broad variety of movements so that they can, again, self-organize and figure things out, kind of what works for them. And then also considering that dependent on different constraints, a given athlete is going to draw on different strategies. So when they're in sports, if there's a time constraint, right, they got to get up off the ground fast to get to a rebound or get to a volleyball, they're going to draw on a different strategy than if they had more time to jump. If there's external resistance, if there's an athlete that is trying to manipulate them, they're going to have to draw on different strategies than if they were unguarded. Fatigue is a great example. A fatigued athlete is going to draw on different strategies, different ways to move than a fresh athlete. So exposing them to a broad variety of patterns is important without saying, hey, you need to move this way. This is how you need to be landing, how you need to be jumping. Talking quick on prerequisites to jump training. I know a figure that's kind of been used is a double bodyweight squat, or you need to be so strong before you can start getting into jump training, plyometric training. I would encourage coaches that kind of hold that view to go out to a playground and see like these kids that are jumping off of equipment twice their height, and they're landing in these weird, awkward, dangerous positions, and they're fine, right? They're jumping onto stuff. And even as we progress, like a lot of the athletes that we get training with us, even if it's their first like exposure to weight training or like jump training in the weight room, they've already been playing sport. They've already been jumping. They already have aggressive foot contacts. So instead of saying, hey, a kid needs to be this strong, we should instead approach jump training by exposing our athletes gradually over time to lower intensity foot contacts, lower intensity plyometrics. This can be as simple as jumping rope, skipping, giving them more dynamic warm-up exposures, but gradually increasing their resiliency and capacity to handle these jump exposures over time, instead of saying, hey, they need to be this strong before they can jump or do a depth jump or a bound. And then just at the bottom are a couple great resources. Joel Smith and his website, podcast, Just Fly Sports, and that's the Train Heroic article that he wrote. Him and Austin Yoakum there, you can find him at yoakumstrength.com or on Instagram. But they are two coaches that I think do a fantastic job of being really creative in how they apply a constraints-based approach to their speed, jump, and athletic development training. And then, of course, we've already talked on Zach DeChant. After we finish with our athletic movement, our sprint, jump, throw, and we head into the weight room, for the most part, we're just trying to get our athletes strong, right? Because as a developmental athlete, if we get stronger, we're going to be more explosive. If we get stronger, that can impact our speed ability. I've got it right up there, KISS. Keep it simple for success. Keep it simple, stupid, if you want to use that one too. But I think it's really important that we approach strength training with that in mind. A lot of coaches tend to put the cart before the horse and they see these advanced techniques that we think are going to yield really great results, but it's just not necessary for a developmental athlete. An analogy that I like to use, and it's not a John Engelbrecht original, I can't tell you which coach I heard it from, but if you know and if you heard this before, please give that coach credit, but is a toothpaste analogy. So we can think of an athlete and their training potential as a full tube of toothpaste. So the toothpaste leaving the tube is then that athlete realizing their training potential or realizing adaptation. And with developmental athletes, untrained or barely trained beginners, we don't have to do much to get toothpaste to come out of the tube. We don't have to do much for them to realize adaptation. We can lightly squeeze from any direction and we're going to get results. Doesn't have to be hard, doesn't have to be fancy. We can approach it from a bunch of different avenues. As that athlete progresses, as they adapt to training, you're going to have to resort to slightly more advanced techniques, right? So we're thinking like rolling the tube of toothpaste up from the bottom or taking your toothbrush and like trying to scrape the toothpaste out. These are the advanced training techniques. However, with a developmental athlete, it is not necessary. It's overkill, and truthfully, it's foolish to apply these advanced training techniques too early, because not only is it unnecessary, but it may blunt the athlete's response to these techniques further down the road when they become necessary to drive adaptation. For most developmental athletes, we never really need to get into super advanced techniques. It can be really simple for athletes throughout their first 4 years of exposure to strength training. So with that simplicity in mind, talking about exercise selection, that's probably the next biggest component of how we're going to prescribe training. What movements do we want to use? There's no such thing as an irreplaceable movement in the weight room. We're looking to apply a very general stimulus that will improve the foundational capacities of our athletes. This is to create more force, right? So getting our athletes stronger. To create force faster, get them more powerful. Or to create force for longer. Muscular endurance, conditioning, work capacity, whatever you want to call that. The list of ways to get these jobs done is nearly inexhaustible, right? So if you want to use Olympic lifts and your athletes are proficient in them, that's great. If they're not, loaded jumps will get the job done just as well. Same thing with the bilateral versus unilateral debate. I know a lot of coaches have kind of gotten into certain camps there. I think well-rounded strength and conditioning program is probably going to include a little bit of both, but that doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other. We can have great success with all kinds of techniques. With exercise selection, a lot of coaches try to get into more sport-specific training with the exercises they select. I would say that sport-specific training is not happening in the weight room. In the weight room, again, we're just building general qualities and a robust base for our athletes. Some exercises may be more specific to sport performance, but no exercise we do in the weight room is going to be truly specific to sport. Now, I think it's important that we don't say, oh, like, we're not preparing them if it's not specific. I think we should take a step back and realize that recognizing that there's not much specific training that goes on in the weight room is not a bad thing, but it's a good thing. It means that there are so many different ways that we can approach strength and conditioning and still get our athletes better. We don't need to worry about being specific to the sport, because anything you do in the weight room, it's not truly specific once we get out onto the practice field. That being said, I'd make a friendly wager. I don't want to put any money because somebody could, get me on this one. But for any reason you can tell me that an exercise is really specific to sport performance, I'd like to think I'd be able to give you at least as many reasons why that exercise is really more of a general exercise. Why is it maybe that specific to sport? Below sport-specific training, just a non-exhaustive list of programs I think work really well for beginner athletes, developmental athletes. 531, Jim Wendler. Like Preston said, I graduated before he got here, so I didn't really have a strength and conditioning coach. I found 531 online. I ran it pretty much throughout high school, and it worked, right? That doesn't mean it's the thing to use. Everything's going to work for a lot of developmental athletes, but I think it's a valid program. Easy Strength and its derivatives from Dan John. 1x20 from Michael Yesis. That's kind of a program that's gaining a lot of popularity, kind of a hot topic now, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it can be used with great success. I know a handful of high school coaches as well as collegiate coaches that are using that with their developmental athletes with great success. And then just a basic linear program, right? It can be as simple as, hey, we want to try and add 5 pounds to the bar every session or every other session. That's a great way for developmental beginner athletes to progress across time. Minimum effective dose training, I've touched on that a little bit, is approaching how we train our athletes with a minimum effective dose. I think it's especially important once we get into the weight room. For us to pursue more of anything, whether it's more weight on the bar, more volume, more exposures, the juice really has to be worth the squeeze for our athletes. Taking a minimum effective dose, applying just enough to our athletes and then gradually building from there is going to ensure that we're covering ourselves and then also protecting our athletes. I know overtraining for developmental athletes, it's going to be extremely rare, but it's still something that we can, say, hey, it's better to be safe than sorry. It's better for me to just give an athlete just enough to progress than really trying to bury them with training loads, training intensities, volumes. That being said, after you've ensured that you've given your athletes a minimum effective dose, once they have what they need, I'd recommend giving them a little bit of what they want, because this is going to increase buy-in into your program. Once they have what they need, if they want to do, and what they want for a high school male athlete is probably going to be like more arm workouts at the end of a session, right? It's not a bad thing to say, hey, yeah, we want you to do that, because that's going to increase athlete engagement. It's going to increase athlete buy-in. So once they have those big rocks of speed and strength training knocked out and you have time and you can give it to them in a safe and controlled manner, let them do what they want, because that, like I said, athletes love that. It's going to get them to, down the line, say, hey, this coach is cool. He's letting me do arms at the end of a workout. I'm going to listen to him, right? It may not be the approach that we all want to take, but it's an effective approach. And then training to failure. I know I talked about with the self-determination theory and building competence that we want to normalize failure in our programs. I don't believe that training to failure in the weight room is necessary or a great approach to developmental athletes. So with training to failure, if we stay a little farther away from training, okay, so non-failure training in the weight room, this leads to better gains in strength, likely from decreased training fatigue and from higher average force outputs in training. This is all Gurgic et al. 2022. This information is coming from this article. It's a systemic review, meta-analysis, takes a bunch of studies together. And then training to failure really only appears to lead to enhanced hypertrophy, and that's only in the setting where we're training with really light loads, right? So if we're like using like less than 60% of an athlete's 1 rep max and they're going to failure with a pump, for the most part, athletes won't be training much below 60% if strength training is our goal. So it's really just not necessary for strength or hypertrophy to train to failure in athletes. Now that's strength and hypertrophy. If we're talking about power training, training to failure is indisputably worse when we're trying to train for power, right? If we want to be powerful, we need to approach that training really fresh with low levels of fatigue so that we can enhance our outputs. In a nutshell, I don't think training to failure is a great idea for developmental athletes. It's certainly not necessary. I'm not saying never train to failure, because there may be some scenarios where an athlete wants to push it, or maybe a coach thinks that it's necessary, but I think just approach that with caution and don't overdo it there. After we get done in the weight room, conditioning, building energy system development. I think as coaches, we need to ask ourselves before we take the time to condition our athletes, because so many of us face time constraints, especially high school strength conditioning coaches, you face time constraints. Asking yourselves, do you have the time to condition your athletes? Is it the most important thing? Should we instead spend time strength training, speed training, jump training? Second question is, how many athletes are truly limited by their conditioning level? Is this what's holding them back for their sport performance? And then third, are they able to build that conditioning through sport practice? Playing more sports in the title there, it's probably a lazy answer, right? You may think, but truthfully, multi-sport athletes especially should be getting what they need from their sport. So for example, with the University of Iowa, now that we're in our spring ball phase, it's more of a football-focused, competitive phase, we don't condition our athletes. They're getting that from their sport practice. Once we're in season, we don't condition our athletes. They're getting that from practice. A well-developed, well-planned sport practice should factor in the specific conditioning needs for those athletes. You may ask, what about athletes in a non-competitive phase? Not all of your athletes are going to be multi-sport athletes. If a kid who's not in season, how should I approach conditioning that athlete? The first question I would ask is it necessary to condition that athlete right now if they're so far away from competition? Maybe we are better served by approaching, that athlete with focusing on being stronger, being more explosive. Then once we get closer, once we get into practice for that sport, then they can start to develop conditioning. If you still think that, hey, I do want to condition athletes for, maybe it really is a limiting factor for them, I don't have a specific answer for you because I don't know what sport you may be working with. But a great resource is going to be Joel Jamieson and his book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, his website, 8 Weeks Out. It's not just for MMA, it's not just for combat sports. His book gives a ton of great examples of how we can develop the different energy systems for different sports. That's a great place to start. Now all of this, back quick. All of this I've been talking about sport performance, conditioning for sport. I'm sure a lot of you as strength conditioning coaches, physical education professionals, won't always be working with athletes, right? You may be working with just student non-athletes. With those individuals, if performance isn't the goal, then a healthy, active lifestyle becomes the goal. And you can't have a healthy, active lifestyle without an aerobic component, without conditioning. So don't skip out on aerobic training. I think a great place to start is with the physical activity guidelines that are put out by the government, right? 2018 second edition, that's a great place to start for the aerobic training. Because from a general health perspective, it's kind of hurts saying this because I would much rather be in the weight room picking up something heavy than out there on a bike conditioning. But from a general health perspective, aerobic training is likely going to be a lot more important than lifting. And I'm not saying get rid of lifting, but you can't neglect aerobic training for your health. I'm forced to kind of confront my bias of preferring weightlifting whenever I run up a flight of stairs. I'm out of breath, right? It happens to us. We can't neglect conditioning for our health. And then, again, Joel Jameson, great resource for that. Next slide, recovery is kind of a hot topic. I think I have a lot of my collegiate athletes coming in and saying, hey, what can I do to enhance my recovery? What's the next biohack that I can go after to enhance my recovery to training? We need to stick to the big rocks, okay? Those 3 big rocks are going to be eat, sleep, and relax or de-stress, right? Trying to alleviate training stress, life stress. Those are the things that we need to detail like 98, 99% of our attention to. Eating. Lane Norton is a great resource in nutritional science. He takes a ton of relevant research, up-to-date research, and distills it for the layperson, right? It's not something where he's like super sciencey. He's really enjoyable to read his content, and he puts out great information. As strength coaches, we can certainly offer some information, some resources to our athletes, whether that's like an infographic or, just resources in general about nutrition, but it's important that we remember to stay in our lane. I'll make the assumption that none of us are like registered dietitians or nutritionists, so we don't want to give like prescription or information that we aren't really confident in. That being said, if we are going to give information, it's important that we don't wander to the fringe. We don't want to like be in like a raw vegan diet camp or like the carnivore diet camp. The good information is going to be somewhere in the middle, and like strength training, it's conceptually pretty simple, but it doesn't mean that it's easy, right? It needs to be approached with great consistency and effort from athletes, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Sleep, the second biggest tenet, or maybe the first, they probably compete for the biggest tenets, nutrition and sleep. Matt Walker, he has a podcast. He kind of goes by the name The Sleep Diplomat. I know there's a Joe Rogan podcast and a ton of other podcasts that he's been on, but he's a professor at one of the UC schools. I don't know if it's Berkeley or Irvine, but he is a researcher that has done a ton of work with sleep and how it enhances not only our lives as athletes, but as humans. In general, 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Talking about sleep hygiene for our athletes, we want to be in a cool, dark, quiet place, or at least there's some white noise. The bedroom should be for sleeping, right? It shouldn't be something where athletes are doing a ton of homework, playing a ton of video games, or they're surfing their screens. We want to try and get screens away from them before bedtime, or at least putting on a blue light filter so that's not so intense for them to look at. And then perhaps the most important aspect for sleep hygiene is just having a consistent schedule. Trying to go to bed at similar times each night, wake up each morning. Something that we can do as strength and conditioning coaches is ask ourselves what our earliest lift group is and if it needs to be that early. Can we give athletes an extra 15, 30 minutes of sleep? If we have like a really long training session planned out, can we look at it and say, maybe this isn't necessary, maybe I can give my athletes a little more sleep? Because that's going to be one of the most important things for young, developing athletes, not only from a physical perspective, but from a emotional, cognitive perspective as well. And then just relaxing. Some of us may say high school kids shouldn't have too much trouble relaxing. They don't have the struggles of the real world yet, but every kid is going to be different. There's always going to be exceptions, whether that's home life stress, a really excessive activity or class schedule, any sort of demands. Trying to get our athletes to just relax, try and alleviate stress. That's going to be a big thing in our recovery. The other modalities, so whether it's foam rolling, stretching, hot tub, cold tub, we shouldn't necessarily deter athletes from using those. We should say that if those make you feel great, that's a good thing. You can definitely use that, but I think that we should have our athletes use it on their own time. Because a lot of these modalities, while they may work for certain athletes, they may not work for others. And that's because they don't work in the way that a lot of us think they do. They don't have a whole lot of mechanical or physiological effects. A lot of times it's just a placebo effect. Hey, that feels really good. I think I feel better because of it. And that's not to be neglected, right? A placebo effect is still an effect. It can still have a positive effect on our athletes, but we shouldn't be taking a ton of time and resources to say, hey, I'm going to sit down and stretch my athletes after a training session or foam roll them for recovery purposes. Letting the kids get home, relax, get a good meal in them, and get a good night's sleep is going to be the most important factors there. That wraps up my presentation. This is a list of sources that I've used throughout the slides. It's not necessarily in a specific order, but for the most part, it kind of starts at the beginning and works its way to the end. I also printed out in that folder over there, I have like 50, I think, handouts if you want to take them with you, and it's essentially just this list of great resources to use, to follow, to look into, because that's, for the most part, where I'm going to draw a lot of my information from, as well as my coaching experiences. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to get up here and kind of rant and rave about some things that I'm really interested in. It was exciting for me, and I hope that you're able to take away both practical and conceptual ideas from this presentation.